Okay. So welcome very much to the second talk in the seminar, and it's again about some scientific modeling, and we will see some more details on the possibilities of obtaining precise scientific measurements of market characteristics. Because, of course, these economic measurements, they are more desirable than just opinions or anecdotal evidence. And all market participants and the government and so producers, consumers, and the processors, all they need this information in order to stimulate a discussion process about the weaknesses and the strengths of the local market. ¿No funciona? Okay. Okay. So here I have collected some news headlines from Latin America, where you see a number of events, of structural shocks which affect agricultural markets in general and livestock markets in particular. So for example, over here you see some headlines on trade measures which inhibit trade and also price dynamics. For example, here Panama bans Colombian agricultural products, or Honduras is not accepting Guatemalan products. And then there is another factor which affects the domestic markets, which is, of course, the world market, as we have heard before. Here you see one headline: drop in milk prices hits Costa Rica, and the drop is on the world market for milk. And a third very important issue affecting the local agricultural markets here in Central America is concentration and market power, as also the minister mentioned. So this is one key issue. For example, here you see some headlines: new international milk processing company formed in Costa Rica, or Walmart sells Nicaraguan milk in Costa Rica. Costa Rica's company's project could raise milk prices in Nicaragua. And a last important determinant which influences the structure of the domestic markets is just a change in the political and economic framework of these markets. For example, over here, changed certification for dairy farms in Costa Rica. And in order to measure the effect of such policy and economic events which affect the market, we need some very elaborate methodology, because otherwise it's very difficult to get any evidence on this issue. Did it matter? Did it matter that Honduras is not accepting Guatemalan pork? And if yes, how strongly did it matter? And we will see, we will get a broad overview of some methodology, how, which was already mentioned by Professor von Kramon before, but we go a little bit more into it in order to get some feeling what can be done and where are the restrictions. Here, this is the structure of my talk. First, I present some background of this issue, and then we will see how the perspective from the part of the science and the perspective of the market participants and of the governments meet each other, and how we can merge these two perspectives. And then, in the second point, we go a little bit more into this issue of nonlinearities. What does it mean? And you will see it, you find it everywhere, basically. So first, we will speak about what is it, and then we will have some overview of a number of models which were already mentioned in the end of Professor von Krammon's talk, and then briefly go to estimation and testing, and then we will see a summary. So, first, let us get some introduction, some more introduction of this issue. So what are the questions of interest we could assess? And these are questions of interest which come from a policy point or from a producer's point and market participants' point. And you will see how these questions can be translated into methodology in order to obtain this precise measurement. And then afterwards to use this precise measurement in order to form decisions and to form policy implications. The first important question is, are markets connected to each other? When you take, for example, bans of wheat exports from Russia, you may think, yeah, markets need trade to be connected to each other. Actually, they not necessarily need trade, because Russia is exporting lots of wheat to the Middle East, for example, to Egypt. And if Russia bans exports of wheat, then prices in Egypt will react, but also prices in Saudi Arabia, because both are big importers of wheat from Russia, although Saudi Arabia and Egypt are not trading with each other. Yeah? But there are some methodologies in order to get real proofs on this, whether markets are related to each other. And then a second question, which was also raised before, is how many markets and which markets do belong to a common network? I mean, here in the context of Central America, and of this increasing integration process, and also, for example, within the European Union, it's a very important question to ask whether these markets which join the political union actually form also an economic market. And tomorrow I will present some results of a study on Brazil, which showed that actually some of the regions in Brazil, they don't belong to the common market, to various reasons. Yeah? The next question, which is very relevant for policy implications and policy analysis, is how quickly are price shocks from one market transmitted to other markets. Yeah? And we have heard already about the extent and the speed. So these are two dimensions of this issue, and when we have a measurement on this, then we can design certain policy implications, or farmers' unions, processor unions, and so on. They can work on increasing the speed of the transmission of price shocks. Another very important question here in the region is whether consumers and producers are equally affected by price changes. And the minister, she mentioned it, that's a key issue because of the increasing concentration during the last decades. On the one hand, the producers are complaining prices are too low, and consumers are complaining the prices are too high. But there is no, it would be desirable to get really a number and seeing what are the different effects and how strongly do they differ from each other, and because then you can go and take this and this and this political decision in order to reduce this asymmetry. Yeah? And another interesting question is whether the market participants in the course of several years change their behavior. Because you have, of course, these groups of market participants. When you have producers, you have processors, you have traders, retailers, and consumers. It's large groups, and it's very difficult to get qualitative evidence on this. But with this methodology based on the time series of prices, you can get some quantitative measurement on whether the participants change their behavior and also how this behavioral change occurred. And then actually you can go and try to work on changing the incentives for this behavioral change. And the last question, which is of interest, is whether it is possible to identify phases of the market development. When you think of European Union, there has been a very intense and rapid development of bioenergy for the last 2 decades, mainly biodiesel in European Union. When in Brazil, of course, it's based on soy, but it would be very interesting, of course, for concluding policy recommendations to get some measurements of the phases of this market development. And in order to be able to get some more detailed analysis on these issues, there are 2 different terms which we should here define explicitly in order to be clear about what we are doing here. First issue is market integration. And of course you can look at this integration, you can see it from different perspectives, but here for these needs it is best understood as the existence of a long-run price equilibrium between 2 markets or between even more than 2 markets, and some trade flows, not necessarily direct trade flows. So what you see, this measure of market integration is something on a long run. So there is no point in assessing market integration for this month. No, that's a very long run issue which you have to think of years or decades even. And it's a bivariate issue. So either markets are integrated or not integrated. And if they are integrated, then you can go and try to evaluate the speed of the price response, which is the price transmission. Yeah? And with this disequilibrium response, we will come into some detail. We'll look in some detail later on, because if the markets are connected by some long-run equilibrium, then you get shocks from the demand side, from the supply side, from the politics, from the world market. You get all kinds of shocks which push the prices for a short term out of equilibrium. But then, just because they are in equilibrium, they try to correct these deviations from the equilibrium. And having some measurement on the speed of this is very insightful. And this price transmission, to the contrast of market integration, has 2 dimensions. First, you get the price transmission in the long run. And then second, you can also say something on the short run price transmission, evaluating this question, how high is the period-to-period rate of the price changes. And here, the price transmission itself is something gradual. It can be between 0 and 1, yeah? While market integration is something which only has 2 possibilities, yes or no. And the basic modeling approach was already mentioned by Professor von Kramon, is the vector error correction model. So vector, because you are considering a network of markets. So you have at least 2 prices you're considering at the same time or more. So, and these prices are collected into a vector. And the basic idea is that what you want to model is the current price movement. And this current price movement is a function of the past price movement. So it's a past price movement plus error correction. And this error correction is nothing else than the response to the disequilibrium due to these shocks. So you have some influence of the past disequilibrium on the current prices, and also some influence on the past price movement. And one would put it into formula in this way, that you have here, this is the vector of price changes in the current period, is a function of this error correction, plus the past price movement, plus some stochastic error term. And what people are most interested in, so we have here 3 parameters which we want to estimate: alpha, beta, and gamma. And alpha and beta are most interested because we have here for beta, when you consider 2 prices, then beta is a vector which looks like this. So you have market A and market B, and beta then, here you have a constant. This is the coefficient for market A, and this is the coefficient of market B. And what it does is, it quantifies the amount of long-run price transmission. And additionally, there is this parameter alpha, which is, if you have 2 prices, also a vector of 2 prices. And this quantifies the speed of short-run price transmission. And then there is the other parameter you have in here, but it's not really interesting because, of course, both policymakers and market participants are most interested in the effects of price shocks. So what happens if the prices are not in market in equilibrium? And a very crucial assumption for all this issue is that the parameters, so these 3 kind of parameters, they are constant, so they don't change. And now let us just think a bit about this assumption, because it's very crucial. Now the research meets the world, real world. So constant parameters mean that the market conditions do not change. And also the behavior of the market participants does not change. Because what you estimate is like an average behavioral parameter for the market participants. But as we have seen at the very beginning is, especially agricultural markets, they are subject to many quite strong determinants. So that's very unlikely that market conditions do not change over a period of several years, and the policy framework does not change, and the behavior of the market participants does not change. That's very unrealistic. Yeah? So we have seen that this issue, that the real world, so agricultural markets, they are subject to many structural, many sources of structural change. And then, of course, in order to get some measurement on this, we have to try to model this kind of structural change in the econometric models. So here, what we have seen in the beginning is that we have mainly, let's say, 4 sources of these different of the structural change. So first we have trade restrictions, which are imposed on a bilateral basis, and then there is the impact of world markets on domestic markets, and then we have this very important issue and source of structural change in the form of concentration and market power. And last, we have some general change in the domestic political frameworks or in the market conditions. And then when you think a bit more about this issue of structural change, then you will see that there are basically 2 distinct forms. So there are, on the one hand, clear structural breaks. So you have one situation on one day, and on the other day you have another one. And you can really say the difference. And in contrast, you have fuzzy instabilities. So there is kind of, trade is, for example, inhibited in some way, but it's not completely inhibited. Yeah? And the amount to which trade is inhibited varies from week to week, for example. So it's not very clear that there is a clear structural break. So what you end up is clear jumps between different regimes of the market. So you have one regime where there is no trade ban, for example, and you have one regime, one time period where there is a trade ban. Versus for the fuzzy instabilities, you get something like gradual change. And this structural change can then have some more characteristics which we should discuss now in order to understand then which kind of behavior you can actually model with these different kind of models. So structural change can differ in its speed. So it can be abrupt, so from today to tomorrow, or it can be changed gradually. Yeah? Then you can think of two states in the market. So you have just one time without trade bans, you have one with trade bans. So it's just basically two different states. Or you could also think, when you have an issue of concentration, then concentration will increase gradually, and it's more than two different possibilities. And this structural change can take place either only one time, which is very unlikely in real-world context, but usually it takes place several times. And the change can be from one direction to another one, or it can switch from one direction to another one, and it switch back, and so on, between two different states. And which is important for policy analysis is that, of course, the timing in some context, the timing is known, so you might know as concretely for which month your trade ban, your export ban is implemented. But in other contexts, for example, in the development of the market, it's not really clear that you say, okay, today the first phase of the market development is finished and tomorrow the other phase starts. Yeah? So you have to try to get some measurement on when is the structural change occurring. And furthermore, in some instances you know what is producing the structural break, for example the export ban, yeah? And in others it's not really clear. For example, export procedures, due to some reason, they get slack, and everything takes, all export procedures take some more time, but this is nothing which is announced explicitly. So from a policy analysis point of view, it's very difficult to identify this trigger for the structural change. And last characteristic is whether the structural change is endogenous or exogenous. Endogenous means that the change is a result of only of the price development, or in contrast, it is a result of some exogenous policy events. If you have at the end of the year the elections, governments might be inclined to decide for some laws which benefit some of the market groups, but they are not really necessary from the market context. So then you have this exogenous trigger. So you see, this issue of the structural change is quite complex, so you get also a high number of models with which you can describe this issue. Now let us come to the second part. What does it mean, the nonlinearities in the transmission of the price shocks? So what we understand as nonlinearities is actually these non-stable parameters, because as we have seen just now, you have so many determinants and they yield the market participants' behavior to change. And changing market participants' behavior is translated or can only be measured with these changing and non-stable parameters. And most frequently, people are interested in the structural change in the short-run price transmission in this coefficient alpha. And then we find here two basic cases. So we have first, if the parameters are stable, then they are called globally constant, and the non-stable parameters, so the nonlinearities, they can either be in jumps or change gradually. And then we have heard already before that there is the model class of regime-dependent models, which is also called piecewise constant or locally constant. And for the gradual change, we have models with smooth or with varying parameters. And now let us have a look into this model variety and the implications of these different kinds of models. So first, there is a linear model which assumes that the behavior of the market participants does not change, the vector arrow correction model. And then there is the group of nonlinear models, which is mostly regime-dependent models, and we have seen the asymmetric vector arrow correction model, and then there is the threshold model, the exogenous switching model, the Markov switching model, and the smooth transition model. And as last here, we have a model with varying coefficients, which is this semi-parametric vector arrow correction model. Let us just review in a short spreadsheet the assumptions and the ideas of these different kinds of models. So here, for the basic model, of course, what I just have described, you have the idea of the stable long-run equilibrium and the temporary deviations due to shocks. So the implicit assumption of this model is that market participants' behavior is stable, and also the framework of the agricultural sector and of the policy is stable. So prices actually always respond the same way because there is no change. And one example for such a model might be that national trade, foreign trade in agricultural products during a few years of stability, which means nothing exceptional happens on world markets and also not in the domestic markets. And then what we can infer from this model is the measurements on long-run and short-run price transmission. And here you see some graphs which are very useful in order to contrast the characteristics of these different models. So actually here on the left-hand side, you see there's just one regime, so no way. There's no regime change, no structural change can occur, which means that the parameter alpha is always one number. It's always stable. And what we have seen here, the price movement in the current period is also always stable, and it does not depend on any external market characteristics. And I will not present any formulas. I prepared a handout which you might have a look at if you are more interested in it, and it will be burned on this CD. And these are just two printouts for some more details. Everything belongs together. Yeah. So these are, and there you get also some examples of analyses which used these different models. And now let us come to this model with the asymmetric correction of deviations. So the idea is that the price response depends actually on whether the deviation from the price equilibrium is positive or is negative. So the assumption is that the participants' behavior changes, depends whether prices are rising or prices are falling. And this is actually one issue which is very relevant here in Central America, because when you think about the case for, let's say, milk, and you have a very high concentration in a processing level, then if producer prices increase, this would mean that the consumer prices in the supermarkets also increase. But just because the processing level has high market power, it will not lower the retail prices in the case that the producer prices decrease again. So the processing level changes behavior depending on whether the prices are rising and falling, and in the end, due to the market power, the processing level is able to get higher marketing margins due to their market power. And this you can measure with that model. So you see that the price response actually depends on the disequilibrium, whether it is positive and negative, and you get two regimes. And the interpretation, so what you can, the kind of information you can get from the model is the correction rates in both regimes, and then also the magnitude of the asymmetry, so how strongly does this behavior differ, and also for in which times do you have which behavior. This can also be assessed from this model. And then the graphs look slightly different. You see, for example, here for the regimes. Now you have two regimes. On the first period you have first regime, second period this, and then here you have a structural break. Then you have the second regime, another structural break, and then it switches back to the first regime, and so on. So now you see that the parameter alpha, which measures the short-run price transmission, has two different values. For negative deviations from the equilibrium, it has this value, and for positive deviations, it might have a different value. So also, the price response will differ. Here, for negative deviation, it is lower, and for positive deviation, it is stronger. And if there would not be asymmetries, it would look like this. And you can see that these differences can be very substantial. And actually, with a model which is very powerful, you can actually test, so you can prove statistically whether you have in a certain market this behavior. And based on this, then you can develop your policy implications in order to avoid the asymmetries. And another model Professor von Grammont will talk about in more detail is the threshold model, which has the basic idea that transaction costs for trade play an important role. So the implicit assumption is that traders, of course, only engage in trade if it's profitable, and the price response depends on whether the price difference between two markets is larger or smaller than the transaction costs. And in the end, you end up with three regimes. And you will see how this looks in the graphs. And for example, an issue is unfavorable landscape or unfavorable infrastructure for trade, which really increases the transaction costs. And the information you can get from the model is, first you get an estimate of the transaction costs, then you get an estimate, three estimates for all three regimes of the correction rates, and you can also construct a history of the development of the market. And this looks then something like this. You see here, you have three regimes. You have one structural break here, so the regime changes, another structural break here, so it changes from second to third regime, and then one structural break here, it changes back. And you can get here, you see the parameters, they are non-stable. For this area, the parameter takes this value, then it takes 0, and if the disequilibrium response takes this size, then it takes another value. And like this, it would look like if there would be in both outer regimes the same error correction. And then there is this exogenous switching model, which has the basic idea that the markets are driven by known exogenous determinants. And these known exogenous determinants might be known policy changes or seasonal periods, where you really can determine when a certain harvesting season, for example, starts and finishes. And the implicit assumption is that you know about these time periods of the market, and then with this model you can estimate the parameters for differing time periods. And the price response depends then on the periods of the market development which you can actually determine in advance. And what you get from the model is the correction rate in these regimes. So it looks like this, that you get here again the structural changes, and then two estimates for two different regimes. And also the price response then differs depending on the regime. And a very similar model is the Markov switching model, which is very similar to this exogenous switching model, but only here the markets are driven by unknown determinants. So you are not really sure which factor drives your market dynamics, and you can actually identify and estimate these changes in the regimes. For example, effects of not announced export bans. Yeah? You know, there were some periods where their export bans were in place, but you don't have any information on really pinning down, oh, it started here and started there. And then you could use this model in order to estimate the regime characterization. So you get then periods for differing behavior of market participants. And these graphics look very similar to the ones before, but just the differences are in here. So this is more flexible because you don't have to know the issues driving the markets. And the last two models, so there's a smooth transition model where the basic idea is that transaction costs play an important role. But the change between the market regimes is not abrupt from one to the day, but it's on a gradual measure. And again, traders only engage in trade if it's profitable, and what you can get out of the model is the development of the correction rates in time and also the regime incidences. So you see here, then you don't get any clear regimes. You get something, you get probabilities, so 20% first regime and so on, and your parameters are not stable. They are changing. As also the price response is not any longer stable, but it is smoothly. And this last model class is the semi-parametric vector error correction model, where the basic idea is that the parameter instabilities are somewhere hidden in the data, because you cannot always be sure how these price relationships changed, so you can try to estimate this change from the data. So the price response on this equilibrium depends on latent determinants. And you don't have a regime, but you have non-stable parameters. For example, trade is occasionally impeded by any measures. And what you can get from the model is the functional form of this equilibrium response, which you see here. So you have basically one regime, but then the price, the parameter varies, and also the price response is very flexible. And this can tell you a lot of the behavior of market participants for large and small deviations from equilibrium. And we have seen already the issue of estimation and testing. For this traditional model, everything is quite nice and the results are very reliable. But for many models, Professor von Grammon will present a recent development for the threshold model. But for many models, the estimation approaches are rather complex and difficult to implement, so you are not always sure whether you really get what you want. And there is the issue of model complexity versus the development of theory, and of course you can select a model also according to your own interest, because as has been mentioned before, these tests which you would like to have, they are partly not existing because the mathematical theory behind is very complex. So interesting questions are there any nonlinearities? So does the behavior change? And is there a specific nonlinear structure? And which one is there? And these questions, they are still in the scientific discussion being developed. So for the choice of the models, one has the economic testing is only of limited usefulness, and then the interest of the development of the market participants' behavior is more important. And one important issue in order to be able to carry out such complex analyses is the existence of the data. And what you basically need is comprehensive data and disaggregated data for any kinds and for any aspects of agriculture markets, because it is not only used by scientists, it's used potentially, it can potentially be used by the government, by all kinds of market participants. So this market information and market transparency due to increased data collection is a side effect which is very valuable, because also processors and producers, they might become more competitive because they have a much clearer picture on the domestic market, and they might be more competitive for exports because they can relate the developments in the domestic market with the developments worldwide. When you see, I mean, here for Central America, probably United States. So what one would like to have is disaggregated and complete data sets in time, so long time series which have no missing values, and in space, so for many regional markets within one country. Because also this, if you have the producers scattered across the country, then of course they would like to know to where to deliver their milk, whatever. Maybe they get in the next city much better price. And then also along the processing chain. But of course, along the processing chain, that's kind of tough, because it's very difficult to get the data from on farm gate price and then for several processing levels. And additionally to the time series data, it would be very useful for the market participants to have also access to trade quantities. And then some regular market reports, which is not necessarily statistical analysis, but there is some independent institution which is assessing the recent market developments on a regular basis, let's say monthly, and then publishing these reports so that all market participants have access to it is already a very valuable contribution to this issue of market information and market transparency. And of course, it's national governments and also the international organizations are doing lots of effort in increasing this information base. So what we have seen is the importance of these structural instabilities in agricultural markets. So due to policy, macroeconomy, world market, weather, and so on. Then we have seen that this structural change can take many different forms. And statistical testing is not yet comprehensively developed. And that's why the economic background and the issue of the policy analysis mainly guides model choice. And these nonlinearities can be found in different dimensions of the price transmission. So we have different modeling approaches. I presented 6 different model types, and each of them puts an emphasis on certain aspects of the market and of the market development and of the behavioral change of the market participants and allows certain insights. But in order to carry out these analyses and to obtain policy conclusions, one is dependent on the availability of disaggregated data. And I mean, this is an important role of the national governments, which have to decide for this, and the international organizations, which are also already pursuing this issue. So, thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Rico, por esta presentación muy completa y detallada. Yo creo que Rico nos ha presentado un trabajo y un resumen muy valioso de los diferentes tipos de modelos, de instrumentos que se pueden utilizar para ya iniciar un análisis de transmisión de precios. Creo que el resumen que hace sintetiza muy bien cuáles son los supuestos de estos modelos, la interpretación de los resultados, algunas limitantes y finalmente otro punto que se había mencionado en la exposición anterior y tiene que ver con la necesidad de información para poder alimentar estos modelos. Yo creo que va quedando claramente evidenciado la complejidad o la necesidad de utilizar diferentes tipos de modelos que pueden ser más complejos cuando las características de los mercados son de igualmente más complejos. Un desafío que aparece es cómo comenzar a utilizar la información disponible, porque nosotros estamos hablando de problemas que posiblemente no vamos a poder esperar 3 años, 5 años, para poder generar recomendaciones de políticas, y cómo con la información disponible, tanto cuantitativa y eventualmente cualitativa, podemos comenzar a dar respuestas a estos problemas. Creo que es un desafío que todavía está en la mesa y me parece que esta presentación nos ofrece una foto muy clara de cuáles son las herramientas desde el punto de vista cuantitativo que nos pueden ayudar a eventualmente encontrar respuestas a la complejidad de estos mercados. Tenemos 15 minutos para preguntas, comentarios. Les voy a agradecer que seamos bastante concretos con las preguntas porque el tiempo es corto. Muchas gracias. Bueno, yo quiero hacer una pregunta. Allá hay una. Perfecto.
Buenas. Disculpe, ¿podría regresar al modelo inicial donde tenía las fórmulas de los betas?
Se presenten, por favor, la persona que está formulando la pregunta, nos diga el nombre y la institución.
Mi nombre es Wolfgang Pejuán, de Zamorano. Solamente a ver si podría ir de nuevo en la interpretación de los coeficientes.
So the idea of the model is very appealing because you can disaggregate the current price behavior. You can discriminate two different determinants. So you can also get, the results on these two parts. So you have the impact of the past prices and the impact of the past equilibrium. Yeah? So this here is the impact of the past disequilibrium. So this is actually the measurement of the past disequilibrium. And this is the measurement of the past price movement.
Gracias, Rico. ¿Hay alguna otra pregunta? Muy bien. Si no hay más preguntas, yo le voy a agradecer al profesor von Kramon que avancemos con la tercera presentación. Esta sería la última presentación del día en lo que es temas cuantitativos. Retomando lo que mencionó Miguel, yo creo que en la tarde vamos a ver algunas presentaciones con ejemplos concretos que nos pueden ayudar a tal vez interpretar estos parámetros ya viendo ejemplos muy concretos. Gracias.